Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Pesachim. We are up to Perek Hey, Mishnah Tet. Today's Mishnayot should be Leinu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. After the blood service was over, they would skin the offerings in order to remove certain parts, which they would burn on the altar, as we will see, Bezrat Hashem Bli Neder in the next Mishnah, so that they could be skinned easily. The offerings were suspended by their hind legs. The Mishnah discusses how this was done. Ketzad Tolinu Mafshitin, how did they hang the offerings and skin them? Unkaliyot shel barzel ayut kivuim bakitalim uva'amudim. Iron hooks were affixed in the walls of the temple courtyard and in pillars that stood in the courtyard. And the commentaries explain a section in the northern side of the courtyard was known as the butchering area, Bet Amitbachayim, and was where the offerings were slaughtered and their hide was removed. That area contained 8 short stone pillars topped with blocks of wood in which hooks were affixed, as the Mishnah says in Tamid, chapter 3, Mishnah 5. In addition, hooks were affixed to the walls of the courtyard in that area, Shebahen Tolinu Mafshitin, and on these hooks they would hang the offerings and skin them. V'chol mi she'eno makom litot ulavshit, and for anyone who had no place to hang his offering and skin it, because the hooks were all occupied by other offerings. Now, due to the great number of Pesach offerings that were brought, there were usually not enough hooks for everyone. The Mishnah says, Maklot, Dakim, Chalakim, Ayusham. There were thin, smooth sticks of wood there. Now the bark was peeled off the sticks to make them smooth. Umeniach al kitefo val ketev chavero, and a person would face his friend and rest one end of a stick on his shoulder and the other end on his friend's shoulder. Vetuleo mafshit, and he would hang the offering from the stick and skin it. Rabbi Eliezer says, if the 14th of Nisan fell on Shabbat, when the sticks could not be used because they were muktzeh. Now the Rav gives us the background. Since the sticks were designated to use for skinning animals, which is an activity that is normally forbidden on Shabbat, they were muktzeh and could not be moved. However, the Tanna Kama holds that the sticks may be used even on Shabbat, because muktzeh is only a rabbinic restriction of Shabbat, and rabbinic restrictions on Shabbat activity do not apply in the temple. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, that the stick cannot be used because it's muktzeh, the Mishnah says, Meniach yado al ketev chavero v'yad chavero al kitefo. A person who could not find an available hook would place his hand on his friend's shoulder, and his friend would place a hand on his shoulder, v'toleo mafshit, and they would hang the offering from their arms and skin it. Now 2 people would face each other, and each would rest his left hand on the other's right shoulder. They would suspend the offering from their arms and use their free right hands to skin it. And that is the end of Mishnah Tet. Mishnah Yud now continues, Kira'o ve'otzi emurav. After the offering was skinned, the owner tore open its abdomen and removed its sacrificial parts, which is the fats and organs that are burned on the altar. Now, certain fats, the kidneys, the diaphragm, along with part of the liver, and when the offering was a sheep, the fat tail, are all burned on the altar, as the Torah speaks about in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 3, Psukim 3 and 4, and Pasuk 9. These parts are known as emurin. The Mishnah says, Netano b'mages v'ktiran al gabei hamizbeach. He put them in a bowl in order for a Kohen to take and burn them on the altar. Now, the acts of skinning the animal and removing the sacrificial parts do not need to be done by a Kohen, and were usually done by the offering's owner, since the Kohanim were occupied with other parts of the service. However, placing the sacrificial parts on the altar must be done by a Kohen. Now, when each of the 3 groups finished making their offerings, everyone would take the meat of their offering to their place in Yerushalayim and would roast it. The Mishnah describes what was done when Erev Pesach was on Shabbat, when they could not carry the meat home because of their prohibition to carry outside on Shabbat. The Mishnah says, Yatzta kat rishona v'yashva lah be'ar habayit. When Erev Pesach was on Shabbat, the first group left the courtyard after making their offerings and sat on the Temple Mount. Now, they would sit outside the temple buildings and courtyards. Now, the Temple Mount was surrounded by a wall and was considered a private domain in which one is permitted to carry on Shabbat. Shnia Bachel, the second group, after finishing their offerings, left the courtyard and sat in the Chel. The Chel was an area that stretched 10 amot from the outer walls of the women's courtyard. It was surrounded by a low partition called the Soreg. Vashlishit b'mkoma omedet, and the third group, after finishing their offerings, stood in place in the courtyard. Now, while the first 2 groups were allowed to sit. The third group, which remained in the main courtyard, had to remain standing, because no one may sit down in the temple courtyard except for the kings from the house of David. When it grew dark and Shabbat ended, all 3 groups left and roasted their Pesach offerings, because the Rav says, and Sliyat Pesach Duchat Shabbat, roasting the Pesach offering does not override the prohibition of roasting on Shabbat. Therefore, they had to wait till Shabbat ended, and then all 3 groups left and roasted their Pesach offerings. That is the end, Rabotai, of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.